So again, my name is Will. It's nice to see everyone here, especially those of you first-time visitors. I'm not normally the person that's up here. I get to fill in today while Phil is out of town and Jason is over in Grantsville. Everybody online, hi. Thanks for joining us. I think Pastor Mike will be there. If you do have questions, please feel free to type them in, and he'll be with you guys. But a brief intro about who I am. My lovely wife, who gave the announcements today. Isn't she beautiful? Yeah. We were missionaries together with our oldest daughter in Haiti for a couple of years, and we've been in Utah now, like three years. Yeah, so we moved to Utah from Haiti, and we both grew up in Missouri and met in college. But our focus in Haiti was children and education, and we'll touch more on that here in a little bit in this sermon. But that's who I am, and I hope today what we have for you kind of inspires some action for you. So right now we're in week number 7 of a series that we're calling What Now? And we're working through the book of Joshua. And Joshua, this is an Old Testament book. It's written a couple of thousand years ago, and it gives an account of the ancient people of Israel as they came into the land that God had promised them. Or what we would like to say is they came into their promised land. So today is the second to last part of our series, and to be honest, we're going to cram a lot of chapters in today. Roughly from 13 to 22 is what we're going to cover today. But don't worry, we're not going to read them all. At this point, the promised land has been conquered for the most part. They've done a good job of clearing the promised land of its former inhabitants, which are the Canaanites, but it's not finished. And now from 13 to 22, we're dealing with specific inheritances granted in the land to each tribe of Judah. So Joshua was commanded to divide that land per tribe. The chapters themselves, I'm going to be honest, really are not that riveting. It's a lot of these people numbering this amount, get this land from this border to this border, so on and so forth through all 12 tribes of Israel. And it goes on and on and on. So it can be a little bit boring. And some of you might agree with that. But that being said, there's still great value to it. And what we want to reflect today is it shows how God fulfills his promises. And it's a moment, really, if you look at the history of Israel, this moment here is very, very significant for them in a certain way, because God fulfilled a promise that took multiple generations to get to. And we'll see, and we'll talk about that. So today we're only going to look at a few passages. Don't worry, we're not going to read it straight through. I get enough of folks going, when is he going to be over already? But it's a good time for us to kind of recap wherever we've been, especially if this is your first time here. So in week 1, we call this the week that Joshua the leader struggles to have faith, but ultimately trusts the Lord. So as the new leader of Israel, he had his doubts about what he could do. Now remember, he's filling the shoes of Moses. So outside of Abraham, Moses is probably the second highest patriarch that the nation of Israel could have. Moses, the part the Red Sea guy. Moses that went up to Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go, Pharaoh." And then Moses, the guy that came down from Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments. Those are some pretty big shoes to fill. He struggled and ultimately trusted the Lord's guidance to be strong and courageous. And this shows us that it's still an encouragement for us to be strong and courageous, because the Lord our God is with us always. Now, week number 2, we met an unlikely new believer, the prostitute Rahab. So this was a lady who really didn't fit the mold of most religious types. She was a liar, a deceiver, a traitor to her fellow countrymen, and yes, as her title indicates, she was a prostitute. Even still, she turned from this and her past to follow the Lord and join the Israelites. We also found out that as not a reward, but as kind of recognition for what she did, she's mentioned in the lineage of Jesus. It's a good reminder to us that anyone who will turn to God, regardless of their past or the current situations they find themselves in, are welcomed into his arms. Remember, God saves those with a past. God uses those with a past. And ultimately, God redeems those with a past. Now, week number 3, we saw another miracle. It was the miracle of the Jordan River and the waters being parted. So when the nation of Israel came to the river, they had to yet again put their faith in God and trust in him. And it was a massive obstacle if you can imagine trying to cross it on foot. God asked them to step into the river and put their faith into him and then watch what happens. And ultimately, he provided for them. He parted the river and they all crossed on dry land into their promised land. God shows us that if he wants something done, nothing is impossible for him. Week 4, we saw the city of Jericho fall. So this was the first city that the Israelites conquered in the promised land. It was a massive fortified city, and it was not conquered in a normal way. So if you guys think about, you've seen the movies back in the, I think of like the medieval times where they siege it and they're shooting arrows and stuff back and forth to each other. That's not what they did there. God told them to walk around it for 7 days straight, blow some trumpets on the last day. There was no assault, there was no siege, and there was no aggression. Israel trusted God and did what he asked. On the 7th day, the walls fell and the city was conquered. We also saw Joshua and the nation engage with God in prayer during this time. And this is an encouragement for us to connect with God ourselves in our daily lives. Our prayers don't have to be perfect. They don't have to be dialed in. They don't have to be eloquent. They just need to happen. Walking around in circles doesn't make sense. And a lot of times our messy prayers don't make sense either. God just wants us to engage with him and watch what he does. So week 5, this was Achan's sin. So if week 4 was an example of Israel's faithfulness and following what God had told them to do, then week 5 is an example of their failure and their unfaithfulness. This was about a man and his family and how they decided to trust worldly provision instead of God and what they were supposed to do. Ultimately, this caused us to look at sin and recognize that sin ultimately doesn't just affect us. It affects everyone around us. It was a sobering reminder that we are forgiven. Our sinful choices can still have earthly consequences. God didn't call things sin to ruin our fun, but rather he identified the things that hurt us and those around us as sin and gave us a warning to avoid those. So last week is what we looked at is God shows mercy even in war. Now this is an interesting one, and it's kind of hard to sum up in this passage and what we're going to look at today. So today I encourage you to go back, look at the YouTube video. If you have questions, they're probably going to be answered there, and if not, reach out to Pastor Phil, me, Pastor Jason, and we can kind of help walk you through it. First, we saw that God sent Israel to conquer the Canaanites. Now those were the people that were living in the land. They were really, really, really evil, and I think he touched on some of the specific things that they were doing. Yet God gave them a chance to repent and turn to him. Some did, while others didn't. They all deserve justice, just like we all deserve justice for our actions, for our sin. But some were still shown mercy, while to others, justice was absolutely served. Some or all of these stories can be hard to relate to, and it can be hard to see the point in reading about people that lived 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, who we call the Israelites. In fact, living in the USA today, some of us might even pose the question on, well, what's so important about them? Why not just read about, what the Aztecs were going through, or read about the Babylonians about 1,000 years after this, right? Well, this brings me to the first note. Israel was chosen by God for his purposes. Or you could say they were God's chosen people. Those kind of sentences are interchangeable, who were invited to be a part of his plan to redeem humanity, even if it would literally take thousands of years for that plan to go forth. That said, since they were God's chosen people, we are able to see the character of God as he interacted with them through their successes and their failures. And we can use that as an example in our lives today. So it's quite important because as we are trying to build that relationship with God, we need to know really who he is. What we see in these stories from ancient Israel is the same characteristics that we see in Jesus in the New Testament are there. God is justice. Jesus is justice. God is mercy. Jesus is mercy. And God is love. And Jesus is the ultimate incarnation of that love. Which leads me to point number 1. God does not change his character. He is consistent. He is steadfast. And that brings us to today and what we're going to read about in Joshua. And as I said, a whole bunch of chapters about territory assignments. So-and-so gets this, from the Jordan River to the west, north to south, and all the people that live within it. Many years have passed, and our main character, Joshua, is now an old man. So if you doubt that, this is where we start. Joshua 13, verse 1. So when Joshua was an old man, the Lord said to him, "You are growing old." And I can relate to that. And much land remains to be conquered. Then God goes on to explain what territories still need to be taken, what actions need to happen, and who is supposed to get what in this landscape of the promised land. So still more to do, and God says this, the second half of verse 6. I myself will drive these people out of the land ahead of the Israelites. So be sure to give this land to Israel as a special possession, just as I have commanded you. In and of itself, to us, this really doesn't seem like a big deal. But remember, last week we'd read several war-heavy passages and then posed the question, did God tell the Israelites to commit genocide? So this verse is yet another passage that reinforces the fact that God did no such thing. We talked about how God used the Israelites to be an instrument of mercy and justice to the people living in that land. But not all were destroyed, as we just read. And he caused the rest to leave. Again, this might be worth looking back. If you have questions, I encourage you to go back, check out that YouTube video and see what Pastor Phil had to say about it. The point is, God didn't say on one end of the Bible, commit genocide, and on the other end of the Bible with Jesus, say turn the other cheek and love your enemy. But back to the main topic of what we're going to look at today. So let's look at just a couple of examples so we have an idea of kind of how this is playing out and what's going on. So Joshua 14, the first 3 verses. The remaining tribes of Israel received land in Canaan as allotted by Eleazar the priest, Joshua son of Nun, and the tribal leaders. These 9.5 tribes received their grants of land by means of sacred lots in accordance with the Lord's command through Moses. Moses had already given a grant of land to the 2.5 tribes on the east side of the Jordan River, but he had given the Levites no such allotment. So there's a lot of this and that, and this people get this and this people get that in these chapters. And as I said, it can be kind of boring. Let's be honest. It's to us today, it kind of is. But it's important for us to understand the context and what's going on here. So let's just quickly review the 12 tribes of Israel. So there's Judah, there's Reuben, there's Simeon, there's Issachar, there's Zebulun, Levi, which we're going to come back to shortly, Dan, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin. So, did anybody count? How many names did I throw out there? I actually mentioned 13 names. Ooh, but we always say the 12 tribes of Israel. So this week, I encourage you to kind of look up what's going on here and study it a little bit. And I'll give you a little hint. It has to do with a guy named Joseph. If you have questions or need to be pointed in the right direction, come find me afterwards. But that doesn't really have to do with what we're doing today. It's more important that you know that these tribes and these names are there. And so let's get back to the tribe of Levi. They were the only tribe not given an allotment of land. And it may seem like the Levites got the raw deal. They didn't get their portion just like everybody else. After all, like we said, they were one of the 13 tribes listed. Sometimes you will hear us say that the Levitical duties, well, they were the priests in the land. And it's a fancy way of saying that they were the ones that were supposed to serve in the tabernacle and then later in the temple after it was built. So they received no specific land allotment, but they received specific cities in each tribe's land allotment. Nowadays, we can seek God directly and repent and be forgiven. We have a personal relationship with Jesus that brings us to the Father. But back then, the relationship happened through the ordinances and the practices that the priests did in the tabernacle and then later on in the temple. So their inheritance was a special connection to the Lord. In other words, the Lord was to be their inheritance. So let's read one more. It's a bit lengthy, but we want to give you one more and some thought about what is going on and how this is going. So we'll bring up a significant point in these chapters and total what they really represent. So Joshua 14, verses 6 through 12. So a delegation from the tribe of Judah, led by Caleb, son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, came to Joshua at Gilgal. Caleb said to Joshua, "Remember what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, about you and me when we were at Kadesh Barnea. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land of Canaan." Now, remember, Moses sent out 12 spies into the promised land to see what they would look like and if they could conquer the people there. Only 2 came back and said that they could take the folks that were living in there. Caleb was one, and the other one was the guy we're reading right about right now, Joshua. So I returned and gave an honest report. But my brothers who went with me frightened the people from entering the promised land. For my part, I wholeheartedly followed the Lord my God. So that day Moses solemnly promised me, "The land of Canaan, on which you were just walking, will be your grant of land and that of your descendants forever, because you wholeheartedly follow the Lord my God." Now, as you can see, the Lord has kept me alive and well as he promised for all these 45 years since Moses made this promise. Even while Israel wandered in the wilderness, today I am 85 years old. I am as strong now as I was when Moses sent me on that journey, and I can still travel and fight as well as I could then. So give me the hill country that the Lord promised me. Again, after that, it's more this people got this land and this numbering this many were set up over here. This particular tribe was granted a special grant of land, and really it was time to deliver on that promise. The key point that we need to look at today brings me to point number 2. God keeps his promises. In fact, that's what this whole section really represents in this story. And it might not seem that much to us because the Israelites and this whole experience represents a promise for them that was given to their ancestor, Abraham, a few hundred years before. So let's take a look at that, all the way back in Genesis 12, verses 6 and 7. Abram traveled through the land as far as Shechem. There he set up a camp besides the oak of Moreh. At that time, the area was inhabited by the Canaanites, the same people that were living in the promised land when Joshua was writing this. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "I will give this land to your descendants." And Abram built an altar there and dedicated it to the Lord who had appeared to him. So God promised this land to the descendants of Abraham. Abraham right now is believed to have been from like 22 to 2100 BC and lived to about 2000 to 1900 BC, anywhere from 175 plus years. And it's believed that Israel entered the promised land around 1450 BC. Those dates aren't exact, just close. So this means the time between the promise that God gave Abram to Israel actually walking into and conquering the promised land was at least 500 years. That's the important part of this section. So let's take a look at some of these important dates throughout the Old Testament because, it's hard for us to relate to what's going on. Anybody remember sitting in history class and you have to remember in 14 whatever, Columbus sailed the ocean blue and this empire lived from this time to this time, and it can kind of get run down and dry. So I'm going to give you a little hint of how you can kind of figure out what's going on, who the main characters are throughout the history of the Old Testament. So everybody do me a favor, hold one of your hands up, doesn't matter which one. Your thumb, we're going to call him Abraham. Your index finger, we're going to call him Moses. Your middle finger, we're going to call him David. Your ring finger, we're going to call him Daniel. And your pinky finger, that's the birth of Jesus, okay? So as you guys look at your hand, you've got 2,000 years of Bible history right here. See, you didn't know you had 2,000 years of history on one hand. So your thumb is Abraham. So everything from your forearm up to Abraham. That's creation, that's Adam and Eve, that's Cain and Abel, that's Noah, we get to Abraham. So in between Abraham and Moses, who's your index finger, that happens to be stories about guys named Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, the slavery into Egypt, the journey into Egypt, and the ultimate slavery that ends up being there. Now your middle finger, this is David. So in between Moses and David, you get the book we're reading now, Joshua, but you also get Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the law. Everything is happening in here. The judges happen in here. And then so you get from David to Daniel, in between your middle and your ring finger, you're going to get Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, Kings, Chronicles is going to happen in there. You get the story of Saul, you get David, you get Solomon. And Daniel talks about the exile to Babylon, right? So from Daniel on to the birth of Christ, that's where we get what we call the minor prophets. So you'll get Ezra and Nehemiah, you'll get Haggai, you'll get Zechariah, you get Malachi. But that's what's going on there, and then you're up to the birth of Christ. So that's just a little helpful. You got 2,000 years of history. So if you're reading and say, I can't remember kind of what's going on, just Abraham, Moses, David, Daniel, Jesus, where do they fit in between? Okay? So that's kind of what's going on there. Remember, back to the story today in Joshua. Remember, Joshua was in between Moses and David, right? There was at least 500 years between the promise to Abraham and when the Israelites entered to the promised land. So God's promise was 500 years in the making. And to put that into perspective for us today, how old's the U.S.? We're not even 250 years old. About 247 years old is what the U.S. is. So if we were judging that based on where we're at today, you've got double the amount of time the U.S. has been around to see this promise fulfilled. For Israel, this was a promise that as descendants of Abraham, it would have been passed down through generation, from father to son, and mother to daughter, over and over and over again throughout these 500 years. It would have been told to Joseph. Remember, the technicolored green coat guy, where's Joseph fall in? Think about that. It would have been told to the slaves that lived in Egypt. It would have been told to the folks living and wandering out in the desert after the Exodus. Leading up to and entering the promised land, the ones that actually entered it would have known this story all the way back from Abraham. And it would have been the fulfillment of God's promise to them. So to them and this people in this day, this is a huge deal what's going on. But 500 years in the making, how many people get upset when Amazon can't deliver in 2 days? How many of us could wait 10 years for a promise to be made? Do you think your great grandchildren could wait for a promise that was made to you to be fulfilled? What does this tell us about God? And that's the point of today. Number one, He does not work on our timeline. Perhaps a promise made to us for our family isn't one we're going to see the fruits of in our lifetime. Have you ever heard this? This is something Phil came up with. I don't think I've ever heard it, but it makes sense to what we're talking about today. So he says you plant a cottonwood tree so you can enjoy it, but you plant an oak tree for your great-grandkids to enjoy. So it's this day and age, it's kind of hard for us to wrap our minds around that. I know that myself, we've moved around a lot. The family farm and folks living and growing up in the same community generation after generation after generation really doesn't happen today. And it gives us a perspective on how God thinks. He thinks transgenerational. He's working things out on His timeline, not our timeline. And I know we had, when we were moving to Haiti, Haye and I spent a ton of time laying out what we would do and how that would look successful and how we would measure what we were going to do. And we ultimately landed on what we wanted to see the kids we were interacting with today. We wanted to see those traits and those values passed on to their children and their children's children. And so our range of success was about 80 years. We knew that we probably wouldn't survive to see the change that was going to be effected. Our hope and faith in God was what we were doing with them and the lessons we were teaching them and the examples that we were giving them, that change would happen. And that's our faith that we won't be around to see it, but 80 years from now, it'll be noticeably different because we suffered for a little bit and one time. Point number two, He has an eternal view. God's working His stuff out in the eternal plane. He sees the bigger, grander picture. And this can be discouraging when we're really stuck in the pain and the hopelessness of the moment. We want things figured out now. We want things fixed now. We want our Amazon new thing that goes in the microwave or whatever it is today. We don't want to wait 2 days for it. And so let's get a bigger glimpse of what actually is happening here. So we're going to skip forward to Joshua 21, verses 43 through 45. So the Lord gave to Israel all the land He had sworn to give to their ancestors. And they took possession of it and settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side. just as he had solemnly promised to their ancestors. None of their enemies could stand against them, for the Lord helped them conquer all their enemies. Not a single one of all the good promises the Lord had given the family of Israel was left unfulfilled. Everything he had spoken came true. So we had mentioned that it took 500 years to see this promise fulfilled and to come true. So remember the struggles that Israel had over these 500 years? They were enslaved in Egypt. They were pursued by Pharaoh in the Exodus. They were wandering in the desert for a generation. They had battle campaigns while entering the promised land. They had tests of faith. They had failures in those tests, time and time and time again. But this passage is one of praise. It declares with confidence that God's promises are never left open-ended, but rather they are always fulfilled. So let me ask you today, what struggles are you facing today? What tasks seem impossible to you to deal with? Where do you feel let down? What do you guys ultimately need to turn over to Jesus? So this leads me to our point number 3 today. Our struggles don't seem as big when we put in their eternal place. And that's how we're going to answer the what now question part of the series today. So when I read something that says it takes 500 years for God to fulfill this promise, it does not make me comfortable. Because again, 2 days, I better have whatever I ordered. And it doesn't seem like, have they ever had this feeling that God's urgency doesn't seem to match my urgency? When things hurt, I need them resolved immediately. 500 years later really doesn't do me any good. And it doesn't seem reasonable to me. And so here are a few examples that we can talk about today. What about the person that's lost their job? They've got bills to pay. They've got a family to feed. God promises he'll take care of us. He tells us, don't worry, be like the sparrows. They don't store up food for tomorrow. But I've got real problems and real needs today that need to be fulfilled. So what are we supposed to do? How about this example? I've got somebody sick in my family. They don't get medical attention. Something doesn't happen to miraculously heal them. They are going to pass away. God, are you even worried about working on my timeline? They've got 6 weeks left. Where are you at to help? How about this? I'm in pain. Somebody's been grieving. They've lost someone. They've lost something. Feels like something's been stolen. They just want resolve. They want healing. And it doesn't feel like God's really doing anything in the moment that pain is happening. So band, if you guys want to kind of start making your way back up. So we hear you. I hear you. Phil hears you. Jason hears you. Your neighbor sitting next to you, we hear you. These are all very real pains and problems. And the Israelites that lived during the 400 years of slavery probably felt similar to some of the things that you guys are feeling today. Like them, there are plenty of times and people I know I've met in the examples I just gave you. It would feel like they never got their promised land. And that is the what now moment for today. What really is our promised land? What is our perspective on what should happen? Do we have a temporal view or do we have an eternal view? So let me put it to you this way. In 1,000 years, will the pain you're going through today hurt as much as it is today? And it's not us belittling what you're going through. But I'll ask you to look around you when you leave church today. Look up at the tops of the mountains. Look up at those peaks that surround us on about 3 sides. Let those remind you of the good times that you've had with your loved ones, something that is positive in your past. Reflect on that. And now know this, mountains really don't exist without valleys. Valleys happen in life. They come, they hurt, and a lot of times they seem like they never end. And they are very, very hard to deal with. Just know that those mountaintops and those good experiences and those good memories are really made possible by the valleys that we walk through in our life. Because we know how quickly we forget the sun when we're stuck in the storm. Here is the truth that we can learn, and this is our bottom line today. Eventually, every storm will pass, and we will see the sun again. So the last verse I'm going to leave you with is this, Romans 8:28. And we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. So let's pray. Father, thank you for your message today and what you've given us and the example of how you are faithful no matter what our timeline looks like, that we can rely on the fact that those promises you've made to us will be fulfilled. Father, help us have a more eternal view of what's going on. Give us that light at the end of the tunnel for the pain and the struggle that we're facing right now to get through those areas. Father, help us realize that your Son will return. The battle is already won. We have to just put our faith in you, rejoice, and know that you love us. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.